Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is Among the Dakotas, a woman's unique experiences with Indians. The subheadline says, Habits and Customs of the Copper-Colored Children of the Plains, Their Weakness for Stewed Dog, a Farewell Dance. It says, in our residence of 14 months among the Dakota Indians, whom we had been taught to look on as altogether barbarous, my sister and I had unique experiences in finding that some things about us shocked their ideas of the fitness of things as much as their customs did ours. We thought a faded calico bag good enough to send over the prairies for our mail, and every 10 days our 2 camp policemen carried that bag to and from the agency. One day, one of the huge fellows said with a serious face that we should have a pretty bag, and he turned to his fellow policeman to ask if that was not so. The other man nodded his head with such vigor that it was plain the matter had been a subject of mortification to both, and that they had consulted how to bring the grievance to our notice without hurting our feelings. The Dakotas disliked much to say anything not altogether complimentary, and we knew the effort it must have cost to express themselves on this subject. We made a smart bag of red flannel, picked out in black. When Cutfoot strapped it across his shoulders over his tidy uniform, he was genuinely happy. Large bustles were worn among civilized people when we went among the Dakotas, but we had to abandon them. We would have had no influence over our charges if we had kept those bustles on. The dogs eaten by these people are quite different from the dogs of which they, like civilized people, make friends and companions. They have square box-like bodies and heads, and scarcely any tails. They seem to fan as readily as pigs. A small teepee near the family teepee is put up for the dog family. The flesh of these dogs is looked on as a dainty, and is eaten with ceremony, and the women bring little tin cups to take some of it to the children at home. For one of the weekly dances in camp, one dog is considered sufficient, but as many as 40 are killed for a great feast. The odor of the stewed dog is very unpleasant, and we had to throw open the windows, even in severe weather, after the school children had been regaled on that dish. The Indian school at the agency was kept by the agent's pretty daughter. She had often observed one of these dogs that seemed to have more sagacity than his fellows. He came every day to school with the child who owned him, and during the exercises he sat beside her on the platform, and joined with the children in the games at recess. She said to the dog's master one day, "Your dog is very fat." "Yes," was the boy's answer, "we will eat him next week." One day there was a knock at our camp schoolhouse door. One of the children, little Amos Blackbull, had brought his dog, one of the edible variety, as a present to us, and had tied him to the step. Of course, Amos was thanked, but his present was not accepted. The Indian children, like white children, imitate life in their play. The girls carry their dolls on their backs, secured by the shawl, for the smallest maid likes a little shawl round her shoulders or thrown over her head. When the dolly is supposed to be fretful, the small mother shakes herself from side to side, as she has seen her mother do to hush her real baby. Their dollhouses are teepees, constructed of an old rag, held down against the force of the wind, like the family teepee, by turf laid round the edge. Besides this, the dolls have what is known as a root house in that severe climate. It is a hole dug in the side of a hill, with a projecting roof of turf, in which are stored such provisions as would be spoiled by freezing. The Indian babies were alarmed by our white faces when we first went among them, and their mothers were mortified by their behavior. But with the assistance of a spoonful of sugar or a bit of hardtack, which they like as much as white children do candy, we were soon on good terms. The Dakotas, unless they have been corrupted by bad white men, are strictly and literally truthful. One has to be careful not to make a mistake in talking with them. When they asked how many sleeps or nights before we meant to do any certain thing, we had to be sure of the number for fear of shocking them by not keeping our word. One is not allowed to change one's mind about engagements either. On one occasion, we had gone the rounds of the camp inviting all, old and young, to a sort of entertainment, a reception we called it, for want of another name. On the day appointed, I was seized with a fever, and my sister decided that we would have to postpone our treat. So she sounded the police signal, 3 taps on the bell, and sent our faithful stiff arm to let the camp know that no one was to come to the schoolhouse that day. But she reckoned without her invited guests. Indians are punctuality itself, and promptly at 4 o'clock, the hour set, they began to pour in. The first comers were allowed to come into my bedroom that they might report my illness to those on the way, but it did no good. The entire camp arrived. My sister rushed for the hardtack that we had meant to be a part of the refreshments and distributed among them at the door and bade them goodbye. Then they went reluctantly home. For the closing exercises of the school, we invited all the camp to come at 10 o'clock in the morning. Before our 7 o'clock breakfast, we saw a wagon drive up filled with parents and children. We gave them pictures to look at, and they were so entertained by these and by our running about in our preparations for the occasion that I do not think they were sorry to wait 3 hours before the entertainment proper began. Our wards became so affectionate that we had to forbid their coming to the house before breakfast. If they stayed too long, it was not an insult to say, in the idiom of their language, that we wished to make the door solid, which meant that we wished to shut the door behind them. The same visitor would be smiling at the door the next day, waiting for admission. It is a grief and mortification to the Dakotas if a teacher leaves their camp. When we found that the climate was too severe for us and decided to leave, they expressed their sorrow in many pathetic ways. They came singly and in number to say that their hearts were very sad. The chief men in the camp came to the schoolhouse and held a solemn council, sitting silent for about an hour and a half. Then one or two said their hearts were sad, and all went away. They gave us a farewell Omaha dance. This is one of their friendly dances. A good many young braves were invited from a neighboring camp to make it a very smart ball indeed. With the exception of a bit of blanket or calico, they wore no clothes except their feather dresses, necklaces, armlets, and ornaments for the scalp lock and the ankles. Their faces and bodies were painted fantastically. We scarcely recognized familiar friends. It was a good deal like a masquerade. Our dignified policemen, Little Dog and Stiff Arm and Cutfoot, whom we had been accustomed to see in the United States Army uniform, were particularly amazing in our eyes. They gave us chairs, and once or twice during the progress of the dance, asked us to rise, that our seats might be placed where we could be still more comfortable. All the Indian women and all the men, except those who beat the drums, sat on the ground or on a plank laid on the ground. The women danced apart from the men. Neither sex paid the least attention to the other apparently. The biggest yellow dog in the camp had been killed to do honor to the teachers. He was stewed in a clothes boiler, and the dish was placed in the middle of the hut. The other refreshments were rice, bread, and coffee, each in a separate clothes boiler. The government gives clothes boilers to the Indians along with stoves. These stoves constitute a part of the annuity goods promised to the Sioux Dakotas in the treaty when they ceded their lands to the United States. When the time came for the refreshments to be served, the young man who got up to dance was conducted by the master of ceremonies to the middle of the room and placed beside the clothes boiler of stewed dog. Then Eagle Dog, who had contributed the yellow dog, was led up and placed beside him. Then the master of ceremonies turned his footsteps towards me. It was a trying moment. I devoutly trusted that it was not right that their head teacher should sit on the ground and eat stewed dog. They must have held a conference and decided that my sister and I were not to be asked to do this. When he reached me, he did not offer to conduct me to the center like the other honored ones. He stooped low and put his head with its huge circle of eagle feathers to my side and rolled it round and round. I stole a furtive glance round to see what the meaning could be. The whole roomful of perhaps 150 Indians were looking calmly on. It was plain that it was the correct thing. The brave held his head up for a moment, and I thought that was the end of the ceremony, but it had to be gone through with a second time. Then he stepped away and began to serve out the feast. Thanks were offered up audibly by each one present, both before and after the supper. This article was written by Susan Dabney Smedes in the New York Post. This story comes from the great state of Kentucky, being reported in the Hopkinsville Kentuckian of August 19th, 1892. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.